I moved into the apartment 3 weeks ago. It was old, cheap, and quiet. At least, I thought it was quiet until I started hearing noises in the vent. At first, I told myself it was just rats. But then, late one night, I heard something else. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Right behind the metal slats. That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone. I moved into the apartment 3 weeks ago. It was cheap, in an old brick building that smelled like dust and old wood. But it was fine. The rent was low, and the neighbors kept to themselves. That's all I needed. At first, everything was normal. The pipes groaned at night, the walls were thin, and I could hear my upstairs neighbor shuffling around. Nothing weird. But then about a week in, I started hearing something else. It came from the vent near my bed. A soft, rustling sound, like something small moving inside. Rats, I thought. Maybe mice. The building was old. It made sense. But after a few nights, the noise changed. It wasn't just scurrying. It was slower, more deliberate, like something dragging across metal. I lay in bed listening, my body stiff. The sound would come and go. Some nights, I wouldn't hear anything. Others, it would wake me up. A faint, rhythmic tap tap tap, like someone lightly drumming their fingers inside the vent. It creeped me out, but I tried to be logical. Maybe it was the pipes knocking, or maybe the wind somehow rattling the old ducts. One night I decided to check. I grabbed a flashlight and crouched near the vent. The screws were old and a little rusted, but the cover was still secure. I shined the light inside. Nothing, just dust and darkness. I let out a breath, feeling a little stupid for even checking. But as I was about to move away, something shifted inside. It was faint, but I heard it. A slow, scraping sound, like fabric sliding over metal. My whole body locked up. I held my breath and listened. Silence. I stayed there for another minute, heart pounding, waiting for the noise again. But it was gone. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Maybe a draft. Maybe something settling in the old ducts. I got back into bed and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I asked my landlord about it. He was a grumpy old guy, always smelled like cigarettes. I told him I thought there were rats in the vents. He gave me this look, like he was annoyed I was even asking. Old buildings make noise, he said. Nothing to worry about. But it's not just knocking, I insisted. It's like something moving. He waved me off. You hear anything chewing through the walls? No. Then don't worry about it. I didn't like his answer, but I let it go. That night, I heard it again, but this time it was different. The sound wasn't just rustling. It wasn't just scraping. It was breathing. At first, I thought it was my own. I was lying in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. My breathing was slow, steady, but then I noticed it. There was another breath. Not mine. It was soft. Too soft to be my upstairs neighbor. Too close to be from outside. I turned onto my side, facing the vent. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was coming from inside. Deep, steady inhales and exhales. Someone was breathing inside the vent. I stayed completely still, every nerve in my body on edge. I wanted to convince myself it was just air moving through the ducts, maybe the heating system kicking on. But then, as I listened, something changed. The breathing stopped, like whoever, or whatever, was inside the vent knew I was listening. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next day, I told myself I had imagined it. I was tired. Maybe I had been half asleep and confused my own breathing with something else. That had to be it, but I knew that wasn't true. All day, I felt on edge. Every time I walked past the vent, my eyes flicked toward it, expecting something to happen. But it was just metal and dust, completely still, normal. By the time night came, I was exhausted. I crawled into bed, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in my stomach. I left a lamp on, even though I usually slept in the dark, just in case. At first, it was quiet. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., I heard it. A slow inhale. A long exhale. I froze. It wasn't coming from outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was inside the vent. I turned my head slightly toward the sound, my heart slamming in my chest. The breathing was steady, deep, too controlled to be an animal. I lay completely still, barely daring to breathe myself. It was close, right up against the metal, and then it stopped. I strained to listen, my ears ringing in the silence. Then a new sound, a whisper. It was so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. A soft, dry sound, like lips moving against the vent's metal slats. No words, just the faintest hint of a voice. I shot up, grabbed my phone, and turned on the flashlight. My hand was shaking as I pointed the light at the vent. Nothing. The whispering had stopped, but the feeling hadn't. The feeling that something was still there, listening, waiting. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I was done pretending it was nothing. I went straight to the landlord's office. I heard breathing in my vent last night, I told him. Not rats, not pipes, breathing. Someone's in there. His expression barely changed. He just sighed, rubbing his temples like I was annoying him. You sure you weren't dreaming? I recorded it. That was a lie. I hadn't, but I wanted to see his reaction. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then he leaned back in his chair. Listen, this building's old. The vents carry sound. Sometimes you hear things from another apartment. Don't go imagining things. That answer wasn't good enough. I want to check the vents, I said. That got a reaction. His jaw tightened. That's not allowed. What? Why? Maintenance only. That made no sense. But I could tell pushing him wouldn't get me anywhere. I left his office more unsettled than before. He knew something, and if he wasn't going to check, I would. That night, I set up my phone to record. I propped it up on my nightstand, facing the vent. If I wasn't crazy, I'd have proof in the morning. I stayed up for as long as I could, but eventually exhaustion won. When I woke up, it was still dark. My phone screen was glowing on my nightstand. The video had stopped recording. I grabbed it and scrolled through the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just me sleeping. The room was still. Then, at 3:15 a.m., the vent cover moved. Just slightly. A shift. A slow, careful motion like something inside was pressing against it. I felt sick. My thumb hovered over the screen as I forced myself to keep watching. And then, a shadow. Something inside the vent blocked the light for a second. And then, in the dim glow from my lamp, an eye. It appeared between the slats, wide, staring straight at the camera, unblinking. I dropped my phone. My stomach twisted so hard I thought I might throw up. My whole body was trembling. I picked the phone back up, forcing myself to press play again. The eye stayed there, watching. Then a whisper. It was impossible to make out the words, but the sound was enough. I stopped the video. Something was in my vent, and it knew I was watching. I didn't go back to sleep. How could I? There was a person in my vent. I replayed the video over and over, hoping I had imagined it. But every time, I saw the same thing. The eye. The slow, deliberate movement of the vent cover. The whisper. I didn't even know what scared me more. The fact that someone was watching me in my sleep, or the fact that they hadn't tried to get out. They just stayed there, watching. I needed proof. Real proof. I sent the video to a friend and then called the police. When they arrived, I felt ridiculous explaining it to them. Someone's in my vent, I said. The officer gave me a blank look. Like a person? Yes. He sighed. They checked the vent but didn't open it, just tapped it a few times and shined a flashlight inside. Nothing there. Because he's hiding, I snapped. Did you even watch the video? The officer crossed his arms. I saw the footage. Could be a prank. Could be a trick of the light. It's not. He sighed again. Look, we can't exactly tear open the vents on a hunch. If you hear or see anything again, call us. That was it. They left. I sat on my bed, gripping my phone, my stomach twisting. The police weren't going to help. I had to figure this out myself. I stayed awake that night, waiting. 2 a.m. Nothing. 2:30 a.m. Silence. Then, at 3 a.m., I heard the breathing again. Slow. Steady. Too deep. Too controlled to be random noise. I stayed completely still, my ears straining. Then a click. The sound of the vent cover moving. I grabbed my phone and hit record, pointing the camera at the vent. My hands were shaking. Another soft scrape. Metal against metal. Then a whisper. This time, I could hear the words. I see you. I almost dropped the phone. My body locked up. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but sit there frozen. I forced myself to look. The vent cover had shifted, and behind it, the eye. It wasn't normal. It was too wide, too unblinking. It just stared like it had been waiting for me to notice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, the whisper came again. Do you see me? I lost it. I grabbed my phone and ran out of my apartment, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked a few blocks away. I didn't go back until morning. When I finally worked up the nerve to return, I kept my phone in my hand, ready to call for help. Everything looked the same. My bed, my desk, my chair, and the vent cover. It was back in place, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew someone was in there, and they wanted me to know. I didn't sleep at the motel. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding like I was still in my apartment, still sitting in front of that vent, listening to the breathing. I kept my phone on the nightstand. The video I recorded just hours ago paused on the screen. The still image showed the vent in my room, and the eye staring back at me. No matter how many times I watched it, I couldn't believe it was real. But it was. I had proof, and I needed to do something about it. I decided I wasn't going to be afraid anymore. I was going to open the vent. I was going to see what was inside. By the time morning came, I had made up my mind. I went to a hardware store and bought a screwdriver, the kind with multiple heads, just in case the screws were different sizes. I don't know why that detail stuck in my head. Maybe I was trying to distract myself from the sheer terror of what I was about to do. The thought of opening that vent made my stomach turn, but I had to know. I had to see. I couldn't keep running. When I got back to the apartment, everything looked the same. My bed was unmade. My laptop was still open on the desk. My water glass from the night before sat on the nightstand. But I knew it wasn't the same. Someone had been in here while I was gone. I could feel it. I locked the door behind me and walked toward the vent, gripping the screwdriver so tightly my knuckles turned white. I stood in front of it for a long time, just listening. Silence. But I knew better now. Silence didn't mean anything. I crouched down and started on the screws. The first one was rusted, but it turned after a few tries. The second was easier. The third took longer, my hands shaking so badly I kept slipping. The last one popped free with a soft clink as it hit the floor. I hesitated. I didn't want to do this anymore. But it was too late. I grabbed the vent cover and pulled. It came off with a slight creak, revealing a dark passage stretching into the wall. A wave of dust hit my face, making me cough. It smelled old, stale, like something had been sitting inside for years. My flashlight beam cut through the dust, revealing metal walls stretching in both directions. The space was narrow, barely wide enough for someone to crawl through. But I knew what I had seen. Someone had been in there, and maybe they still were. I leaned in, angling the flashlight deeper. The passage disappeared into darkness, curving slightly. The dust inside looked disturbed, like something had been moving through it recently. Then I saw it. A piece of fabric, caught on a jagged edge of metal. My breath hitched. I swallowed hard and reached for it, my fingers brushing over the rough cloth. It was gray, torn, stiff with age. But it wasn't just a random scrap. It was part of a shirt, a human shirt. I yanked my hand back, my pulse hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, a noise, deep inside the vent. Soft, a slow, shifting sound, like someone adjusting their position. My whole body locked up. I held my breath, straining to listen. Nothing. Had I imagined it? I didn't think so. Something was in there, and it was awake. I was about to shove the vent cover back into place when I noticed something else. Just a little further in, barely visible in the dim light, the walls were scratched up. Not from rats, from fingernails. There were words carved into the metal. Messy, uneven, like someone had been in a hurry. I angled my flashlight and squinted. The scratches formed letters. Don't look. My throat went dry. I moved the light further. More words, overlapping in layers, scratched deep into the metal. He sees through the walls. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Another message, carved in even deeper than the others. Don't speak. Don't breathe. Don't move. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been in here before me, and they had been terrified. I suddenly felt exposed, like something inside the vent was watching me right now. Then, a rustling. Behind me. I whirled around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. My breath caught in my throat. Nothing. The room was empty. But I felt it. That awful, sinking pressure. Like someone had been standing right behind me. I turned back to the vent, heart pounding. The darkness inside seemed deeper now. Heavier. Something was in there, and I wasn't supposed to see it. I grabbed the vent cover and shoved it back into place, twisting the screws so fast my fingers slipped. When the last one was in, I stepped back and stared at it. It looked normal again, like it had never been opened. But I knew the truth. Something lived inside those walls, and I had just let it know I was listening. I should have left right then, packed my stuff, gotten in my car, and never looked back. But I didn't, because even after everything, the whispers, the breathing, the messages scratched into the metal, I still needed to know. I couldn't stop thinking about the vent, about the fabric I found, about the messages. Who wrote them, and where were they now? That night, I forced myself to stay in the apartment. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't even get into bed. I sat in the chair at my desk, my back to the wall, staring at the vent, waiting. The hours dragged. Nothing happened. Until 3 a.m., the breathing started again. I clenched my fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, like I was sinking into it. Then, a click, the soft metal creak of the vent cover shifting. I gripped my phone, my finger hovering over the record button. My body screamed at me to run. Instead, I whispered, "Who are you?" Silence. Then, a whisper, "I see you." My whole body locked up. The vent cover shuddered, and then it started to open. I scrambled backward, knocking over my chair. My breathing came fast and ragged as the cover tilted, inch by inch. A sliver of darkness appeared, and then, fingers, thin, pale. They gripped the edge of the vent, slow, deliberate, like whatever was inside was taking its time. I couldn't move. I watched as the fingers curled, pressing against the metal. It was coming out. I snapped out of it at the last second. I bolted for the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. I spent the night in a parking lot. I kept my phone clutched in my hand, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to convince myself that what I saw wasn't real. But I knew it was, and it wasn't going to stop. Not until I found out what was inside the vents. Morning came. I should have gone to the police. Should have found someone, anyone, who would listen. But I didn't trust them anymore. They had already dismissed me once. I had to do this alone. I returned to the apartment. The vent cover was back in place, but the screws were loose, like someone or something had been in and out. I tightened my grip on my flashlight. Then I did something I never should have done. I climbed inside. The metal was cold against my hands and knees. Dust filled my nose as I shuffled forward, my flashlight flickering against the tight walls. I moved slowly, carefully. Every sound echoed, my breath too loud in the small space. The messages scratched into the metal stretched further than I thought. Some were old, nearly faded. Others were fresh. I kept going. The vent turned sharply to the left. The air was stale, heavy with something I couldn't place. Then ahead of me I saw it. A small opening, barely visible in the dim light. My stomach turned. The space beyond was bigger than a normal vent should be. A crawl space. Someone had been living in here. I crawled inside. My flashlight trembled as I swept it across the tiny space. A tattered sleeping bag was shoved against the corner. Empty food wrappers littered the floor. The walls were covered in more scratches. Some weren't words, just deep, desperate claw marks. And then I saw the notebook, a battered, spiral-bound notebook sitting in the dust. I grabbed it, my fingers stiff. The cover was worn, stained with something dark. I flipped it open. The handwriting was frantic, barely legible. Page after page of the same sentence, written over and over. He lives in the walls. I swallowed hard, flipping further. The handwriting changed. Messier. More rushed. He waits until you sleep. He watches. He whispers. If you listen, he knows. If you answer, you're his. My breath caught. My fingers tightened on the pages. The final entry was different. Scrawled, uneven letters. He's not alone. A sharp scraping sound echoed behind me. I turned. The vent I crawled through was closed. And in the dark, something was breathing. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The vent was shut, and I wasn't alone. The breathing was slow, deliberate. Right behind me, a quiet sound, a patient sound. My flashlight flickered, the dim glow barely cutting through the heavy darkness. The air inside the crawl space was thick, pressing against my skin, making it harder to think, harder to breathe. I didn't want to turn around, but I had to. I forced myself to look over my shoulder. At first, there was nothing, just the cramped walls, the layers of dust swirling in the stale air. Then I saw them. Fingers. Pale. Long. Just barely visible in the shadows. They curled around the edge of the vent's corner, unmoving, like whoever or whatever was behind them was waiting, watching. I held my breath. The fingers twitched, and then a whisper. I found you. The voice was soft, too soft, like it wasn't coming from someone's mouth, but from the air itself. I lunged forward, kicking the vent in front of me. It didn't budge. I kicked again, harder. Still nothing. Behind me, the fingers curled tighter. They scraped down the metal with a slow, deliberate drag. I could hear them moving. I could feel them getting closer. I kicked the vent one last time, but the cover wouldn't come loose. The whisper came again. I see you. And then the fingers disappeared. For a second, I thought maybe it was gone, but then I heard it. A new sound. Not a whisper. Not breathing. Crawling. A shuffling, dragging sound, moving fast, scraping against the metal walls. It was coming after me. I threw myself forward, scrambling down the crawl space as fast as I could. The sharp metal scraped against my knees and elbows, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The sound was getting louder. Closer. It was gaining on me. The whisper came again, right at my back like it was breathing against my neck. Where are you going? I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. I turned a sharp corner and nearly slammed into another vent cover. A way out. I reached for it, pushing as hard as I could. It didn't move. Behind me, the crawling sound stopped. For a second, there was only silence. Then, a hand wrapped around my ankle. Thin, too thin. Ice-cold fingers curled around my skin. I kicked wildly, panic surging through me. My foot connected with something soft, something that shuddered at the impact. The grip loosened. I didn't hesitate. I turned back to the vent cover and threw everything I had into it. The metal groaned, then snapped open. I fell out, hitting the floor so hard I barely had time to react before I heard it. A thud inside the vent, a scuttling sound. It was still coming. I lunged forward, grabbed the vent cover, and slammed it back into place. My fingers fumbled for the screws, twisting them as fast as I could, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The second the last screw was in, I stepped back, heart hammering, waiting. The room was silent. No breathing, no whispering, no movement, like nothing had ever happened, like there was nothing there. But I knew better. I grabbed my keys and ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car. I locked the doors, my hands shaking so bad I could barely put the key in the ignition. I drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just had to get away. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even break my lease. I left everything behind. A few days later, I checked the building's website. My apartment was already listed for rent again, like I had never been there, like nothing had ever happened, like they had done this before. I thought about calling someone, the police, a news station, but what would I even say? That something lives in the vents? That it watches you when you sleep? No one would believe me. No one ever does. But I still have the video. I still have the notebook I found. Proof that it was real. That he was real. And every so often, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear it again. A whisper. A breath. And I know. He's still looking for me. This story is a chilling reminder that sometimes the things we ignore, the strange sounds in the night, the feeling of being watched, are very real. The tenant in this story thought he was safe in his own home, but he was never alone. And the worst part, he still doesn't know who or what was in those vents, or if it ever left. How many people lived in that apartment before him? How many never made it out? If you ever hear breathing where there shouldn't be any, don't listen. Don't answer. And whatever you do, don't look.